My name is Caden Perlick, and I wrote my paper on social media usage over time and its possible correlation to the modern rise in mental health disorders in America. So basically what I did is I took those two things and I looked at the broad data analysis. I did a broad data analysis, and I'm going to be comparing that data of social media usage and the rise in mental health disorders in America and comparing it to the social media response by the companies and platforms that are some of the largest companies and platforms that we use on social media every day. So first, we have the intro to the topic of social media usage and mental health in the United States. This is just a little bit about my paper, what it's going to be about, or what it is about. So there are two things that are evident in the 21st century. One, we are being ever more consumed by our use of social media, and two, we have seen a large uptick in mental health challenges within our society as a whole. Because of these two things having become some of the most defining features of our society so far this century, people have begun to make a connection between the two, leaving them with questions that they want answers to. So people have started to see this correlation, basically, or at least come up with this correlation on their own. They're saying, hey, there's this large rise in mental health challenges in the United States and this drastic rise in social media usage. Is it a coincidence that these two things just so happen to start at the same time? I don't know, that's what we're looking at. So first, they're asking, is there really a correlation between these two features of our modern society? And two, if this correlation does exist, what are social media companies doing to fix it? And are those things enough if they are doing anything? So the definition of social media that I used was the definition that Merriam-Webster provides. And they say that social media is basically a form of electronic communication, such as websites for social networking and microblogging, through which users create online communities to share information, ideas, personal messages, and other content, such as videos. I wanted to have a base definition so we know what we were thinking of when you're reading the paper. You know exactly the kind of social media I'm talking about, which is pretty broad, but I did want to clarify that I'm thinking of modern social media, right? So between the year 2000 and the present day. Some examples that I gave, three of which I used in my actual paper. Twitter, Snapchat, Facebook, YouTube, they're some of the biggest ones currently being utilized in the US right now. The ones that I used in my paper, being Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, have some of the most interesting responses, I think, of any of the ones that we've seen so far. They're especially the ones that have gotten the most news attention by far. So we'll be looking at those in a little bit. So first, we're basically going to be looking at social media usage over time, looking at all the data that there is to look at on that, breaking it down between the age demographics, and comparing those two between the early 2000s and this year, 2021. So obviously, as we've seen, since the adoption of social media, the amount of people using it has seen a drastic increase, basically at an exponential rate over time. So as you can see right here, from 2005, or in 2005 rather, there were just 7% of American adults utilizing social media in one form or another. This included 10% of all internet using adults. So you can see that anyone using the internet was already slightly more likely to be using social media on average compared to just the average adult. And then we skip over to 2021, this year, where we can see that this number has actually skyrocketed. We currently have 72% of all American adults utilizing social media, which is a very large number that is probably nearing the maximum number of people who even have access to it. So if you actually look now at the age demographics that I have below that, below each of those years, I split it up so we can see total usage by each of those age demographics. First, in 2005, 18 to 29-year-olds, there were 12% of them in total who were utilizing social media in some shape, form, or fashion. 30 to 49-year-olds, 8%, 50 to 64-year-olds, 5%, 65 and up, members of the population, 2%. So as you can see, there's this trend where the younger you are, the more likely you are to use social media. Older you are, the less likely. Now jumping to the year 2021, we see the same thing, except these numbers have drastically increased and the differential between them has significantly decreased as a ratio of, the total number of people who are actually using it. So 18 to 29-year-olds, again, we're just looking at adults, and 18-year-olds, so adults in the US, no children. 84% of all 18 to 29-year-olds are utilizing social media in one form or another. That is probably, once again, nearing the maximum number of people who even have access to it. 81% of all 30 to 49-year-olds, 73% of 50 to 64-year-olds, 45% of all people aged 65 and up. So again, you can see that trend here where the younger you are, the more likely you are to be utilizing social media. But one thing I want to point out is that the actual increase over time is much higher in terms of how much more likely you are to be utilizing social media in the modern day compared to 2005. That rate is much higher, has increased by a much larger margin than for the older age demographics and the younger age demographics. So you can see what I'm saying down here. In 2021, 18 to 29-year-olds were 7 times more likely to utilize social media compared to 2005. So that's the same thing we're going to be doing with all these other age demographics, is looking at how much more likely they were in 2021 to be utilizing social media than they were compared to 2005. So 30 to 49-year-olds were 10.125 times more likely. 50 to 64-year-olds were 14.6 times more likely. 65 and up members of the population are 22.5 times more likely to be utilizing social media this year than they were in 2005. So this is a clear trend where it shows older members of the population are adopting social media at a much faster rate compared to younger age demographics. And that's, again, because you only have so many people that can utilize it. So that rate is going to be slowing down once you start to get up there. But you can see over time, in that same time span, we saw this rate for the older age demographic increase by 22.5 times, and for the younger age demographic, just 7 times. So this will come into play later on. So first of all, I looked at 3 different forms of mental health challenges that are most prevalent to people, most thought about in the United States. The first one I looked at was suicide. Ever since the year 2000, as is the case with many mental health challenges, the suicide rate in the United States has been on the rise and continues to rise to this day without signs of slowing down. But it's very intriguing for a couple of reasons that I'll get into right now. The suicide rate among the American population is actually accelerating as time goes on, so it's not slowing down at all. Between the years of 2000 and 2006, the increase in the rate of suicide was 1% per year. So it was increasing, the rate was increasing by 1% per year between those 6 years. Then, after 2006, for the next 10 years, this rate of increase, or this increase in the rate of suicide was actually 2% per year. So it was increasing by 2% per year, which is very significant. Because this is something that isn't slowing down even today. This is continuing to rise alongside the usage of social media. In the year 2000, the average suicide rate for the entire population aged 15 and up was 10.4 for every 100,000 members of the population. By 2016, this number had increased to 13.5 out of every 100,000 members of the population. This represents a 29.8% increase in just 16 years, which is a significant increase when you're talking about something as drastic as suicide. And now looking at the bottom of the page right here, I have compared the rates in 2000 to the rates in 2018. These are actually pretty interesting when you look at them, and it's something that I think shows a correlation somewhat, and I'll get into that in a second. So you can see from 15 to 24-year-olds, you compare those two age demographics, this actually increased. They're all increasing, right? So one intriguing thing that I noticed was when you compare this to, when you look at the age demographics and the utilization of social media over time, as time went on, the older age demographics were actually the ones, their rate of usage of social media was increasing at a faster pace than the younger age demographics. And it's kind of the same thing we see going on here. The younger you are, yes, there was an increase, but it wasn't as much as these older age demographics. Just to show you what I mean, down here in the 15 to 24-year-old range, the difference was only 2.9 per 100,000 members of the population was the increase. But then you get up to 64 to 74-year-olds, the difference was about, well, it was relatively the same. We see 45 to 64-year-olds. This was a giant increase of about 5.75-ish. So we see this intriguing pattern emerge where not only is it increasing overall, both the usage of social media and the rate of suicide, but they're increasing in similar rates, right? But there are some detractions in this data that make me basically not give it a weak correlation status, because you can see that in the 75 and up members of the population that actually decreased in the rate of suicide. 64 to 74-year-olds, that increased, but it didn't increase at the same rate as the rate of social media usage increased for the same age group. So there is a correlation there, but I'll get to that later. The next thing I looked at was depression, so the data on depression in the United States over time. Interestingly, even though the prevalence of a lot of mental health challenges have been on the rise in the United States since the turn of the millennium, the rate of depression in most age demographics have actually stayed relatively the same, and I say here in some cases, but in reality it's most cases they even dropped slightly. The average rate in 2005 to 2006 for the entire population aged 12 and up who experienced depression within any 2-week period was 5.075%, while the average rate in 2016 had dropped to 4.65%. So again, you can see an actual drop here in the rate of depression in the United States among people aged 12 and up. Even though the age demographics being observed aren't the exact same in each scenario, the trend can still be seen. So basically what I mean by that is when you're looking at the way I have split the age demographics down here between the two time ranges, you can see that they aren't the exact same. And that's because of the data that was actually available and my ability to get it from reliable sources. I try to get the most similar amount possible from the most reliable sources possible. But it holds true if you look, what I was saying holds true if you look at specific age demographics that are very similar or the exact same. So if you look at these two that are the exact same, a one-to-one comparison, there was actually between 12 and 17-year-olds, 12 to 17-year-olds, there actually was a significant decrease in the rate of depression between 2005, 2006, and 2016. A pretty significant decrease too. 18 to 39-year-olds, again, not the exact same age demographic, but a very similar age demographic. Went from 4.7% to 4.4%. That would be statistically the same. A very small decrease. But again, this just leads back to my point of that there is no correlation between depression in the United States and the usage of social media. The rate of depression is on the decline. The rate of social media usage is on the rise. Now, the last most significant mental health challenge that I wanted to look at that interested me the most, given the actual results that I found, was the data on anxiety in the United States over time. So as for anxiety, this is the area of mental health that is arguably seeing the most significant change in terms of prevalence in the United States, but not for the better. The rates of anxiety in the United States have significantly risen since the turn of the millennium. The overall prevalence in 2001 to 2003 rather, defined by, quote, having experienced anxiety in the past year, was 2.7% of the population aged 18 and up. So 2.7% of adults. While in 2019, the prevalence, given the same qualifying definition, jumped to 15.6% of adults having experienced anxiety in the past year. So that is a drastic increase, a 577% increase in anxiety's prevalence in the same age demographics in just a 16 to 18 year time span, right? So the prevalence of anxiety within each age demographic in the American population has not only changed for the worse, but it has changed to nearly perfectly match the prevalence of social media usage with each of the age groups. So basically what I mean by that, and why I think this is so significant, is not only do we see this correlation between social media usage and anxiety, the rising level of anxiety, through the fact that we have this very large dramatic increase in social media usage, and we see this very large dramatic increase in anxiety prevalence in the United States in adults. But when you actually plot this, if you plot both of these pieces of data down here at the bottom by age onto a bar graph, you would see that in 2001 and 2003, this data would look like a bell curve, right? So you have the youngest members of the population, the oldest members of the population actually being the least likely to experience anxiety, and the middle-aged members of the population, people who would be in the middle of the bar graph, being the most likely to experience anxiety in the past year. So then you come over here to 2019, and if you were to plot this data on a bar graph, you would see that the younger you were, the more likely you were to have experienced anxiety, and that continues all the way up to the oldest age groups. So you have 18 to 29-year-olds, the most likely, the next age group up, slightly less likely, but the second most likely. Then you have the next age group up, the third most likely, then the fourth most likely. So you have this declining curve rather than a bell curve. Now the reason specifically this is intriguing is because this data actually, the curve actually changed to match what you would see a curve look like if you were to plot the data of social media usage by age group for the same year in 2019. You would see that the youngest members of the population were the most likely to utilize social media. And you would see this extremely similar drastic change in the actual number of people who experience it and its prevalence. So to me, this change, not only in the actual raw numbers, but the change in the curve to specifically match what this curve looks like for social media utilization, is very significant, because this data over here, 2001 to 2003, that was taken before social media. There was probably a couple percent of people in the entire country utilizing social media, right? And then we come over here to 2019 when there's 70%, upwards of 70% of people in the US using social media. We have this change from, okay, so right before social media takes hold to social media begins to take hold and is dominating our society. We see this pattern emerge where it is perfectly matching basically the same things we're seeing in the patterns of utilization of social media. So I think that is very intriguing to see that play out. So the next thing we're going to look at is the 3 responses that I decided to see from each of the 3 major social media companies and platforms that we utilize on a daily basis, those being Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. So first we have the response by Twitter to this public outcry and this problem. So the response to the clear effect that social media has on anxiety among the American population by Twitter has become one that a lot of people look at when there are questions about balancing people's free speech with their ability to say and do certain things on the internet. So basically what I mean by that is they have this dichotomy, right, of where you have one side saying that we shouldn't do much, even though there could be a problem with social media and our mental health. We shouldn't do much because it infringes on our free speech, our censorship, and it's censorship. And then you have this other portion of the population saying that it doesn't matter, we should do something because this is a public health crisis. We need to get things under control. I mention that because the overall response to Twitter's response to, stress inducers on social media that lead to things like anxiety, like harassment, bullying, hate speech. You have both sides commending Twitter for their response. You have the side who are proponents of free speech, commending them for not going too far and them still being able to say what they want within good reason. And then you have on the other side people commending them for doing what seems to be a good job at cracking down on the things they need to crack down on. The reason I mention that is because when you can see two separate sides come together in agreement, you've found a good middle ground and that this is something that you are doing good. This is a good response. So the responses in particular, number one, they became the first to ban the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, for inciting violence, which set a huge precedent. Now, I mentioned this not to be polarizing or anything like that, because it is a very polarizing topic, but no matter what your opinion is on the topic, this is something that set a huge precedent for the topic at hand here being squashing social media's effects on our mental health. So regardless of what you think of this banning or your opinion on that president, this is something that is needed to be mentioned here because it sets a huge precedent for where Twitter stands and what they are willing to do to people who they think, in their opinion, are mistreating and abusing their terms of service, abusing their platform, to say things that, in Twitter's opinion, shouldn't be said. So this is something that we can look at and go, okay, this is where Twitter stands. Number two, Twitter utilizes a robust reporting system instead of utilizing elaborate systems of machine learning algorithms. So what I mean by this is Twitter actually uses this large elaborate system of response or reporting capabilities where people can go through and they can report other users' posts, they can report other users' accounts for things that they don't like, and then they will have, whether it's machine learning algorithms or people, go through and quickly, efficiently, and effectively and accurately determine whether or not this indeed does fall into this category of abusing the terms of service, ignoring the terms of service, what have you. A lot of people commend them for this because they're not relying on machines to do it as much. This is a reporting system, so people, if they don't like something, they can report it. It's not up to them, it's up to the people using their platform to see the things they don't like and to get rid of it. 3, they allow people to moderate their experience with these. Again, this falls back in line with the reporting system that they have, except added in there, they have the ability to, they allow people on their platform the ability to delete responses to them. Basically just self-moderate their entire experience. They can block people, allow people to follow them who they want to, or disallow people to follow them who they don't want to, etc. And 4, this is something you're going to see with a lot if not all social media platforms, is they reserve the right to ban users for ignoring their terms of service. So ignoring anything that's in their terms of service, whether it's harassment, anything like that, they reserve the right to ban you, and this is pretty effective. So now moving on to the response by YouTube. YouTube was actually probably one of the early social media platforms to tackle the problems that led to anxiety and stress when using their platform with their crackdown on hate speech, harassment, and other harmful things that took place on their platform. In 2016, YouTube updated their terms of service, which was met with much backlash due to worry about people's freedom of speech. They cracked down on harassment of other creators for any reason, and they also cracked down on harassment within the area of YouTube that included hate speech based on gender, race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation. So this was probably one of the biggest and earliest things that we saw a social media company do in terms of cracking down on things that would be large stress inducers, thus leading to anxiety. And this was met with quite a large public outcry, again, due to proponents of free speech. And a lot of users on the platform, they didn't like the system. And a lot of it came down to the fact that they were using a lot of machine learning algorithms. There were a lot of glitches in the system, and YouTube is notorious for lacking any sort of good response to people, good or bad, in situations that have happened on their website regarding this user and social media and YouTube. So if something happens to someone, there's never a time that they can really get into contact with YouTube, and it's this whole thing that people really like to critique them for, understandably. So specifically, they updated the terms of service to include a robust harassment policy that was much broader than it was before. They gave creators the ability to moderate their comment sections, such as the ability to ban keywords or phrases. They reserve the right to remove videos, which this is arguably the most effective thing that they do, because it actually attacks people where they make money. So it reserves the right to remove videos, demonetize videos, ban creators if they violate terms of service, etc. Again, this is something that actually people among the entire social media universe understand is probably one of the most effective implementations of anything that a platform has utilized, because it has had the most visible effect on how people are treated on the platform, who is using the platform, what you're seeing on the platform, everything. Harassment is down, hate speech is down, and you don't even need the data to see it. It's a very obvious, drastic difference. And 4, they utilize a large system of machine learning that combs videos for any such content listed above. Again, this is something that they were criticized for, but I think it has come to be a pretty big positive in the end for them. Lastly, we have the response by Facebook. This really took off, I think, in the 2016 cycle, but nothing actually really started to happen in the 2016 presidential election cycle, but nothing really began to happen until like the 2019-2020 presidential election cycle. So basically, Facebook really began to take notice of everything that has to do with stress caused by social media usage after large public outcry to their practices of 2019 and 2020 during the presidential election cycle. People began to call out Facebook and what they saw as their lack of action to stop the spread of stress-inducing false information regarding politics and the subsequent rise of harassment, hate speech, and bullying because of it. So on Facebook, as everyone is well aware of, in the 2020 election cycles, just as the 2016 election cycle, there was a lot of false information being spread on social media. Facebook being the main culprit of where this stuff was happening. People would pose as credible sources, or they wouldn't even try and pose as credible sources, and they would just repost things that were completely false about politics, about people that had different opinions than them, anything like that. This was a very large problem, and Facebook really didn't do anything about it in 2016, but they did decide to do stuff about it in 2020 once the outcry got so large. And this is something that people wouldn't typically think of as a stress inducer, this false information, but it actually is, because a lot of the ways that people would try and spread false information is through tapping into that fear response in your brain. So they're looking at something, they're saying, oh, this person is attacking you, this person is attacking your way of life. But in reality, it's just awful hate and just complete and utter lies. for the most part, which is a large stress inducer, which leads to significant levels of anxiety among people because they think their way of life is being threatened by the things they're seeing when in reality it's not. So the response is specifically number one, they started to send people messages if they had come into contact with false or misleading information that hadn't been flagged by them. 2, newly made false or misleading content is to be flagged with a banner that informs the reader that the information contained within the post is false or misleading. So they actually have it to where you cannot even look at a post if they have independently verified that this is false or misleading content, or content that has been edited in some way. They don't even let you look at it. So 3, they have a system to manually moderate your page and posts. Again, just like Twitter and YouTube, you can block people. You can delete comments, certain keywords and phrases. You can block. You can basically do anything you want in terms of moderation that has to do with your posts and pages. Number 4, users have the ability to customize what groups of people can see their page. It goes back to the manual moderation thing. You can set your pages or specific posts to private or public, and then you can set which groups of people you want within those private or public domains to see your posts. So this is a great way to combat harassment, bullying, etc., because you can customize your social media experience to be whatever you want it to be in terms of who you want to be seeing your stuff. Because you're not adding anyone you don't know or you don't want to see your stuff. You're blocking anyone that you don't want to see your stuff. You're making specific things private. You're making specific things public. You are moderating your entire online life. And then lastly, Facebook reserves the right to ban you for breaking their terms of service. Again, this is the same thing that we've seen with all the other ones. This is one of the most effective ways of stopping harassment, hate speech, and bullying. Because even if you're anonymous, they can still ban that account. So basically, my conclusion is that overall there seems to be some correlations that exist in some areas, but in other areas this correlation seems to be either non-existent or very small. So number 1, we looked at suicide. I say that there's a weak correlation there because of there is a correlation, I think, because of the actual rise that we see in social media usage and suicide rates as a total and as a whole. But we also see some detractions in there where some things don't specifically line up with the increases when you break it down into specific age demographics. Number 2, depression. I say there's no correlation there. We saw an increase in social media usage, but a decrease in depression rates. Anxiety, I think this is the most intriguing and the most evidential one that we have that shows a strong correlation between the two. We have the shape of the curves if you were to plot the data between social media usage over time and the actual prevalence of anxiety over time. The curve in anxiety prevalence actually changes to perfectly match the curve that you would see in a bar graph of social media usage within the same years. On top of that, we see a drastic rise in social media usage, and then subsequently, in the same time period, just as social media usage is kicking off, we start to see a drastic rise in anxiety almost immediately. The companies, and then lastly, the companies behind social media platforms seem to be in agreement with me when it comes to the responses that they have implemented. They tend to implement things that focus on limiting harassment and online bullying, which are large contributors to everyday stress, thus leading to anxiety. In some cases, we have even seen platforms like Facebook targeting fake news, which has risen as a large contributor to modern stress and anxiety as well. Personally, I would say that social media companies have responded well to the growing problem. However, some would disagree due to concerns over censorship and freedom of speech. Overall, I would conclude that social media's response, given what they and I both think, or given what they seem to think and what I think have strong correlations between the usage of social media and mental health. I think what they've done is very commendable and pretty much all they can do at this point while trying to balance the dichotomy of, free speech proponents and actually getting the job done. Will we see, we can't currently know what the effects of this are, whether it has been effective or whether it has been not effective, because we're still just too early on in these processes taking shape. But within the next few years, we'll definitely start to see results. And if these anxiety levels start to drop, we will know that there is likely a correlation between these implementations of social media platforms and how they're cracking down on harassment, bullying, and hate speech, and that subsequent drop that we might see. So thank you. Again, this is my paper in regarding social media usage and its possible correlation to mental health in the United States. And yeah, thank you. My name is Caden Perlick.